The crackle of thunder split the sky as Harriet Jennings clutched her ruined valise to her chest, her once beautiful blue dress now clinging to her skin like a second, unwelcome layer. Durango, Colorado was supposed to be her fresh start, not this mud-soaked humiliation that left her stranded on the outskirts of town with night falling fast and nowhere to go. The stagecoach had abandoned her here after the wheel broke, the driver muttering apologies about getting help before hurrying the other passengers into town, promising to return. That had been 2 hours ago, and the storm had only worsened since. Harriet shivered violently, her teeth chattering as she huddled beneath the sparse branches of a cottonwood tree that offered little protection from the deluge. The year was 1876, and she was 22 years old with nothing but $16 to her name, a teaching certificate, and a letter of employment from a town that now seemed impossibly distant. She blinked away raindrops from her lashes, trying to decide whether to risk walking toward the distant lights of Durango or remain by the broken-down stagecoach. Neither option seemed promising as the rain turned the road into a river of mud. The sound of hoofbeats approaching made her heart leap. Through the curtain of rain, she saw a figure on horseback, tall and imposing against the stormy backdrop. As he drew nearer, Harriet straightened her spine despite her sodden appearance. She may have lost everything else, but she refused to surrender her dignity. "Miss, you all right out here?" The man's voice carried through the downpour as he reined his horse to a stop. "The stagecoach left me," Harriet called back, hating how her voice trembled from the cold. They were supposed to return. The rider dismounted with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. As he approached, she could make out more details: tall, broad-shouldered, with a weather-beaten Stetson pulled low over his eyes. His boots made squelching sounds in the mud as he approached. "They ain't coming back tonight. That wheel's busted good and no one's fixing it in this weather." He stopped a respectful distance away. "Name's Brody Austin. I've got a ranch about 3 miles from here." Harriet hesitated. Her mother's warnings about strange men echoed in her mind, but the alternative was a night in the rain. "Harriet Jennings," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I was to be the new schoolteacher in Durango." Brody nodded, then without ceremony removed his long duster coat. In one fluid movement, he stepped forward and wrapped it around her shoulders. The sudden warmth and the scent of leather, horses, and something indefinably masculine enveloped her. "Can't have Durango's new teacher catching her death before her first day," he said, a hint of kindness softening his rugged features. "My ranch is closest. My sister Clara's there. She can get you dried out and fed. Tomorrow I'll take you into town proper." Harriet clutched the coat around her, feeling the warmth of it seep into her chilled bones. "I couldn't impose, not an imposition when the alternative is pneumonia," Brody interrupted, already turning toward his horse. "Can you ride?" "It's been some years," she admitted. Without further discussion, he helped her mount, then swung up behind her. His chest pressed against her back as he reached around to take the reins, creating a shelter of warmth that made her breath catch. The intimacy of the position would have scandalized her mother, but right now, all Harriet felt was grateful. "Hold tight, Miss Jennings," he instructed as the horse began moving through the storm. Harriet closed her eyes against the rain, acutely aware of the stranger's strong arms on either side of her. The coat smelled of smoke and prairie grass, and despite her predicament, she found herself relaxing against him as they rode through the deluge. The journey to the Austin ranch seemed both endless and all too brief. By the time the outline of a substantial homestead emerged from the rainy darkness, Harriet had learned that Brody Austin ran one of the most prosperous cattle operations in the area, that his sister Clara had been managing the household since their parents died 3 years earlier, and that he had strong opinions about the railroad companies trying to buy up land in the territory. What she hadn't learned was why a man like him was out riding alone in such weather, or why the protective way he held her against the storm made her heart beat faster than the thunder overhead. The main house was modest but well built, with warm light spilling from its windows. As they dismounted, a young woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. Brody, I was about to send the hands out looking for. The woman stopped short when she spotted Harriet. Oh, who's this? Clara, this is Miss Harriet Jennings, Durango's new school teacher. Found her stranded by Cottonwood Bend where the stagecoach broke down. Brody helped Harriet down from the horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Miss Jennings, my sister Clara. Clara's eyes widened as she took in Harriet's bedraggled appearance. Good heavens. Get her inside this instant. The next hour passed in a flurry of activity. Clara, who was 19 and possessed of seemingly boundless energy, ushered Harriet to a small bedroom where she provided a nightgown and a simple dress that was slightly too large. It'll do until your things dry out, she explained, eyeing Harriet's ruined blue dress with sympathy. After changing, Harriet found herself seated at a sturdy kitchen table, a bowl of stew before her that smelled so delicious tears sprang to her eyes. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment. Brody entered from outside, having seen to the horse. He'd changed into dry clothes, and with his hat removed, Harriet could see his features more clearly: strong jawline, straight nose, and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. His dark brown hair was damp and curling slightly at the edges. Eat, he encouraged, taking a seat across from her. Clara makes the best venison stew this side of the Rockies. It's wonderful, Harriet agreed, attempting to eat with ladylike decorum despite her hunger. I cannot thank you both enough for your kindness. Clara waved away her thanks. Nonsense. We couldn't leave you out there. Besides, it's not every day we get company, especially someone educated, a school teacher. She looked positively thrilled. Brody's been saying for years Durango needs a proper school. Brody shot his sister a look that Harriet couldn't quite interpret. Miss Jennings doesn't need to hear about that now. Hear about what? Harriet asked, curiosity piqued. Clara ignored her brother's warning glance. Brody's been on the town council fighting for a schoolhouse for the past 2 years. His motion finally passed this spring. That's why they hired you. Harriet looked at Brody with new interest. You're responsible for my position. Just did what needed doing, he replied, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Too many children around here growing up without learning their letters. Brody reads more than anyone I know, Clara added proudly. Has a whole library in his study, a cattle rancher with a library. Harriet found herself revising her initial impression of Brody Austin. She'd imagined most men in this territory would be rough, uneducated types concerned only with their herds and the next whiskey bottle. What sort of books do you enjoy, Mr. Austin? She asked. Practical ones mostly, he answered, but there was a flicker in his eyes that suggested otherwise. Clara laughed. Don't let him fool you. I found him reading poetry last week. Brody's cheeks colored slightly. Whitman has some interesting ideas about America. The conversation flowed easily after that, and Harriet found herself relaxing for the first time since she'd left Boston 3 weeks earlier. The warmth of the kitchen, the kindness of these strangers, and the security of having a roof over her head combined to make her feel almost at home. As the evening wore on, Clara showed Harriet to the small guest room. It's not much, she apologized, but it's clean and dry. It's perfect, Harriet assured her, touched by the girl's hospitality. Left alone, Harriet sat on the edge of the narrow bed. Her clothes hung drying near the small fireplace, including her once fine blue dress that now seemed a remnant of another life. She thought of Brody Austin's coat wrapped around her shoulders, how he'd appeared like some guardian angel in the midst of the storm. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, something that made her wonder if fate had more in store for her in Durango than simply teaching. Sleep came quickly that night, deeper and more peaceful than any she'd known on her long journey west. Morning arrived with brilliant sunshine that made it hard to believe the previous night's tempest had been real. Harriet dressed in Clara's borrowed clothes, pinning her hair as neatly as she could without her usual combs and pins. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Brody alone in the kitchen, cooking breakfast. The domestic scene surprised her, this tall, imposing man deftly cracking eggs into a cast iron pan. Good morning, Miss Jennings, he said without turning. Hope you slept well. Very well, thank you. You're quite skilled in the kitchen, Mr. Austin. He glanced over his shoulder with a slight smile. Man living out here learns to do a bit of everything. Clara's gone to gather eggs. Coffee's hot if you want some. Harriet poured herself a cup, savoring the rich aroma. I wanted to thank you again for last night. I'm not sure what would have happened if you hadn't come along. No need for thanks. He slid the eggs onto 2 plates. I'll take you into town after breakfast. The stagecoach company should have your luggage at their office by now. Will you join the school board? Harriet asked suddenly. Since you were instrumental in establishing the school, your continued involvement would be valuable. Brody hesitated, setting the plates on the table. I'm not much for committees, Miss Jennings. Please call me Harriet. After sharing your home and borrowing your coat, formality seems unnecessary. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a current of awareness that made her cheeks warm. Harriet, then, he said, her name sounding different in his deep voice, and I suppose you should call me Brody. Breakfast passed with easy conversation. Harriet learned that Brody had inherited the ranch at 19 when his parents died from influenza, that he employed 6 cowhands, and that he'd expanded the operation considerably over the past 8 years. And you? He asked. What brings a Boston lady to the Colorado Territory? Harriet hesitated. How did you know I'm from Boston? Your accent, subtle, but it's there. She smiled, impressed by his perception. I needed a change. After my father died, there wasn't much keeping me there. She didn't mention her former fiancé, Richard, who had broken their engagement upon learning her father's death, had left her with debts rather than inheritance. Clara returned, and soon they were readying for the trip into Durango. Harriet's blue dress was mostly dry but badly wrinkled and still bore muddy stains at the hem. You can borrow that dress until you get settled, Clara insisted when Harriet tried to return it. Consider it a welcome gift. The ride to town was pleasant in the morning sunshine, with Harriet seated beside Brody on the wagon bench. Clara had stayed behind to manage household affairs, giving Harriet a quick hug before they departed. Will you come to dinner soon? She'd asked. I so rarely get to talk with another woman. Harriet had promised she would, touched by the invitation. As they approached Durango, Brody grew quieter, his easy manner from breakfast replaced by a more reserved demeanor. The town itself was larger than Harriet had expected, a bustling center of commerce with a main street lined by substantial wooden buildings. The stagecoach office had indeed collected her luggage, and the manager apologized profusely for the previous day's mishap. We sent men out looking for you last night, Miss Jennings, but the storm was too fierce. Thank goodness Mr. Austin found you. Next, Brody escorted her to the small boarding house where arrangements had been made for her lodging. Mrs. Peterson, the proprietress, was a plump, gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. We've been expecting you, Miss Jennings. Your room's ready upstairs, simple but comfortable. Meals are at 6, noon, and 6. No gentlemen callers after 8. She gave Brody a pointed look at this last rule. I'm just seeing Miss Jennings settled, he explained. Town council business. Mrs. Peterson's expression softened. Of course. You've done more for this town's education than anyone, Mr. Austin. The school building's coming along nicely. Harriet's room was indeed simple: a narrow bed, a small writing desk, a washstand, and a wardrobe. After the luxury of her Boston home, it might have seemed sparse, but to Harriet it represented independence. It's perfect, she told Mrs. Peterson genuinely. After the older woman left them, Brody lingered awkwardly in the doorway. The school's just 2 blocks down. They're still putting on finishing touches, but it should be ready before classes start next Monday. Would you show it to me? Harriet asked impulsively. He seemed surprised but nodded. If you'd like. The schoolhouse was a simple but well-constructed building with large windows to let in natural light. Inside, rows of desks awaited students, and a larger desk stood at the front for the teacher. A blackboard covered most of one wall, and bookshelves currently empty lined another. Harriet walked slowly around the room, running her fingers over the smooth wood of the desks, envisioning the space filled with children eager to learn. What do you think? Brody asked, watching her from near the door. It's wonderful, she said sincerely. You've given these children a tremendous gift, Brody. He looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. It's just a building. It's far more than that. It's opportunity. She turned to face him fully. Thank you for bringing me here not just to the school, but to Durango. If you hadn't found me last night, anyone would have done the same, he said, but they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken words and the growing awareness that their brief acquaintance was coming to its natural conclusion. I should let you get settled, Brody said finally. You must have much to prepare before classes start. Yes, of course. Harriet felt a strange reluctance to see him go. Please thank Clara again for me, and I meant what I said about coming for dinner. She'd like that. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew a small book. Thought you might want something to read while you're getting settled. It's Whitman, the poetry Clara mentioned. Harriet accepted the book, touched by the gesture. I'll take good care of it. Keep it, he said. I know it by heart anyway. With that, he tipped his hat and was gone, leaving Harriet standing in the empty schoolhouse with a book of poetry in her hands and the strange feeling that something significant had just begun. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Harriet met with the handful of town officials responsible for education, ordered supplies for the school, and began planning lessons. She discovered there would be approximately 30 students ranging in age from 6 to 16, with widely varying levels of previous education. Word of the new schoolteacher spread quickly through Durango. Harriet found herself the object of curious stares and friendly greetings as she moved about town. Several mothers approached her to introduce themselves and their children, and a few eligible bachelors made thinly veiled attempts to court her attention. Through it all, Harriet found her thoughts returning to the Austin ranch and its taciturn owner. She'd been in town for 4 days without seeing Brody, though Clara had stopped by the boarding house to invite her for Sunday dinner. Brody's been busy with the herd, Clara explained, but he asked about you. Did he? Harriet tried to sound merely polite rather than eager. Clara's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. He's not usually one to rescue damsels in distress. You made quite an impression. The schoolhouse was completed on Friday, and Harriet spent Saturday arranging the room and unpacking the books that had arrived from Denver. She was placing the last volume on the shelf when a shadow fell across the doorway. Looks like you're nearly ready to start shaping young minds, Brody said, leaning against the doorframe. Harriet turned quickly, unable to hide her pleasure at seeing him. Brody. Yes, everything's coming together nicely. He stepped into the room, looking around with approval. You've made it feel like a real school. That was the goal. She smoothed her skirts, suddenly conscious of her appearance. She was wearing one of her better dresses today, a forest green that complemented her auburn hair. Clara mentioned you've been busy with the herd. Spring calving, he explained, always keeps us running, but things have settled now. He cleared his throat. Actually, I came to town on business but thought I'd see if you needed any help here. That's very kind, but I'm nearly finished, she hesitated, though I would appreciate your opinion on something. The school board has approved funds for a small library, but I'm not certain what books would be most valuable for the children here. Brody seemed pleased to be consulted. For the next hour, they discussed literature suitable for various ages, debated the merits of different history texts, and compiled a list of recommendations. Harriet was impressed by his knowledge and thoughtful suggestions. You're full of surprises, Mr. Austin, she remarked as they finished. Not many ranchers would be so well versed in educational literature. My mother was a teacher before she married my father, he revealed. She believed education was the greatest gift you could give a child. When they died, I found her collection of books on teaching methods. I've read them all. She would be proud of what you've done here, Harriet said softly. Brody's eyes met hers, and that same current of awareness passed between them. For a moment, Harriet thought he might say something more personal, but instead he glanced at the window where the afternoon sun was beginning to lower. I should let you finish up. Don't forget about dinner tomorrow. Clara's planning quite a spread. I'm looking forward to it, Harriet said truthfully. After he left, she found herself standing in the empty classroom, feeling strangely bereft. There was something about Brody Austin that called to her something beyond his handsome features or the kindness he'd shown her. Perhaps it was the glimpses of depth she kept discovering beneath his reserved exterior, or the way his eyes seemed to see her more clearly than anyone ever had. Sunday dawned bright and clear. Harriet attended services at Durango's small church, where she was introduced to many of her future students and their parents. Afterward, she returned to the boarding house to change for dinner at the Austin Ranch. Mrs. Peterson had been watching her preparations with knowing eyes. "Mr. Austin doesn't invite many people to that ranch of his," she remarked. "Keeps to himself mostly, except for business." "It was actually Clara who invited me," Harriet corrected, though she couldn't help wondering about the implications of the older woman's comment. "Clara's a sweet girl, but that ranch is Brody Austin's domain. Nothing happens there without his approval." Mrs. Peterson adjusted Harriet's collar with motherly familiarity. "He's a good man, one of the best in these parts, been turning down eligible women for years." "I'm sure Mr. Austin's romantic prospects are none of my concern," Harriet said primly, though her heart beat a little faster at the information. Mrs. Peterson merely smiled. "Of course not, dear." Brody himself arrived to collect her at 2 o'clock, driving a polished buggy rather than the work wagon they'd used previously. He'd clearly made an effort with his appearance, his usually work-worn clothes replaced by clean dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a vest that emphasized his broad shoulders. "You look very nice, Miss Jennings," he said as he helped her into the buggy, his hand warm around hers. "Thank you." "And it's Harriet, remember." His smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and bringing a light to his eyes. "Harriet, you ready for Clara's interrogation? She's been planning questions about Boston society all week." The ride to the ranch passed pleasantly, with conversation flowing more easily than Harriet had expected. Brody pointed out landmarks and shared bits of local history, revealing a deep connection to the land that had been his family's for 2 generations. "My grandfather came out here in '49, not for gold but for land," he explained. "Said a man could breathe out here like nowhere else on earth. I never understood what he meant until I went back east once on business. Spent 2 weeks in Chicago and couldn't wait to get back to open sky." "I'm beginning to understand that feeling," Harriet admitted. "There's something about the vastness here that makes one feel both insignificant and infinitely free." Brody looked at her with surprise and something like appreciation. "Most Easterners just complain about the dust and lack of conveniences." "Oh, I've done my share of that too," she laughed. "But beneath the discomforts, there's something compelling about this place." When they arrived at the ranch, Harriet was struck anew by its well-maintained appearance. The main house, barn, and outbuildings formed a neat complex, with corrals and fenced pastures spreading outward. Several cowhands tipped their hats as Brody drove past. Clara greeted them enthusiastically, hugging Harriet as if they were old friends rather than recent acquaintances. "I've been counting the days. Come in, come in. Dinner's nearly ready." The interior of the house revealed more about its owners than Harriet had noticed during her brief stay. The furnishings were solid and well-made rather than ornate, but there were touches of refinement, framed landscapes on the walls, shelves of books in the parlor, and a piano in one corner. "Do you play?" Harriet asked Clara, gesturing to the instrument. "Terribly," Clara admitted. "Mother insisted we both learn, but Brody was the one with the talent." Harriet turned to Brody with raised eyebrows. "You play the piano," he shrugged, looking uncomfortable. "Used to, don't have much time for it these days." "That's not true," Clara contradicted. "He plays most evenings after dinner. You should hear him with Chopin, it's beautiful." Dinner was a delight: roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables from Clara's garden, and an apple pie that rivaled any Harriet had tasted in Boston. Throughout the meal, Clara peppered her with questions about Eastern fashions, social events, and cultural happenings. "You must miss the theaters and concerts," she sighed. "The most excitement we get here is the occasional traveling show." "There are compensations," Harriet replied, her eyes briefly meeting Brody's across the table. "Boston has its charms, but also its constraints. A woman's path there is rather narrowly defined. "Is that why you left?" Brody asked directly. Harriet hesitated. She hadn't spoken of Richard to anyone in Durango, finding it easier to simply say she'd sought opportunity in the West after her father's death. But something in Brody's straightforward gaze made her want to be equally honest. "Partly," she acknowledged. "My father's business failed before his death, leaving significant debts. My fiancé decided he'd rather not marry a woman without prospects or dowry." She kept her tone light, but even after months, the humiliation still stung. "Teaching was one of the few respectable options available to me. When I saw the advertisement for Durango, it seemed like Providence, a fresh start in a place where no one knew my circumstances." Clara's expression was sympathetic. "How awful of him to abandon you when you needed support most." "His loss," Brody said simply, but the look in his eyes conveyed more than his words. After dinner, despite Clara's pleading, Brody initially refused to play the piano. It was only when Harriet added her own gentle request that he relented. "Just one piece," he warned, seating himself at the instrument. What followed astonished Harriet. Brody's large, work-roughened hands moved over the keys with unexpected delicacy, drawing forth a Chopin nocturne with such feeling that she found herself holding her breath. The music filled the room, melancholy yet beautiful, complex yet accessible. When he finished, there was a moment of silence before Harriet spoke. "That was extraordinary, Brody. You play with real emotion." He looked almost embarrassed by the praise. "Music makes sense to me, always has. Our mother insisted we have culture out here in the wilderness, as she called it." "She succeeded admirably," Harriet said softly. The remainder of the evening passed in pleasant conversation. As darkness fell, Brody suggested it was time to take Harriet back to town. "Must you go so soon?" Clara protested. "It's been wonderful having another woman to talk with." "I have final preparations for tomorrow," Harriet explained. "My first day of classes, of course." Clara hugged her warmly. "But you must come again soon, perhaps next Sunday." "I'd like that very much," Harriet agreed. The night air was cool as Brody helped her into the buggy. He tucked a blanket around her legs before taking his seat beside her, the gesture both practical and oddly intimate. They had traveled about a mile in comfortable silence when the first raindrops began to fall. "Looks like we're in for another storm," Brody observed, glancing at the darkening sky. "At least I'm not stranded by the roadside this time," Harriet said lightly. He chuckled, the sound rich in the gathering darkness. "That's how we met, though. Can't say I'm sorry about that part." The admission, simple as it was, made Harriet's heart beat faster. "Neither am I." The rain began to fall more heavily, fat drops that quickly turned the road muddy. Brody urged the horses to a quicker pace, but the storm intensified rapidly, the spring shower becoming a downpour. "There's a line shack about half a mile ahead," he shouted over the rain. "We can wait it out there." Harriet nodded, already soaked despite the buggy's small canopy. By the time they reached the small cabin used by the ranch hands during roundups, her dress was drenched, clinging uncomfortably to her skin. The memory of their first meeting was impossible to ignore. Brody helped her down from the buggy, then quickly saw to the horses, tethering them beneath a lean-to attached to the shack. Inside, the cabin was basic but clean, a single room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. "Let me get a fire going," he said, moving efficiently to stack kindling in the stove. Harriet stood dripping on the plank floor, shivering slightly. Without a word, Brody shrugged out of his coat not the duster from their first meeting, but a wool jacket that looked fairly new. Just as he had that night, he wrapped it around her shoulders. "Seems we're making a habit of this," he said with a small smile. "My ruined dresses, thank you," she replied, pulling the coat closer. It held his warmth and scent, bringing immediate comfort. Once the fire was lit, Brody straightened up. "It'll warm up soon. I'm sorry about this detour." "It's hardly your fault. Nature has its own plans." She moved closer to the stove, extending her hands toward its growing warmth. Brody remained standing near the door, as if reluctant to move closer in the confined space. Water dripped from his hair onto his shoulders, and his white shirt had turned nearly transparent where it clung to his chest. "You should come warm yourself," Harriet said, gesturing to the stove. You're as wet as I am." He hesitated, then joined her by the fire, careful to maintain a proper distance between them. The small room seemed to shrink further with his proximity. "I apologize for the impropriety of this situation," he said formally. "I assure you my intentions were only to keep you from the worst of the storm." "I know that," Harriet replied, surprised by his sudden stiffness. "I trust you completely, Brody." His eyes met hers, and something in them made her breath catch. "You shouldn't, trust me, I mean." "Why not?" she asked softly. "Because I've been thinking about you since the moment I found you in that storm." The admission seemed dragged from him against his will. A gentleman wouldn't have such thoughts about a lady he barely knows. Harriet's heart hammered in her chest. What thoughts? Brody looked away, jaw tight. Inappropriate ones. The tension between them was palpable, charged with unspoken desires. Outside, rain hammered against the roof, creating a cocoon of sound that seemed to separate them from the rest of the world. "Perhaps," Harriet said carefully, "I've had similar thoughts." His gaze snapped back to her face, searching for confirmation. "Harriet, I know it's sudden," she continued, emboldened by the intensity in his eyes. "We've known each other barely a week. But I feel a connection to you that I can't explain." Brody took a step closer, close enough that she could see the raindrops clinging to his eyelashes. "I've never believed in love at first sight," he said roughly. "Always seemed like nonsense from dime novels. And now," she whispered, "now I'm not so sure." His hand rose slowly to her face, giving her every opportunity to pull away. When she didn't, his fingers traced the curve of her cheek with exquisite gentleness. "You should know I'm not like your Boston fiancé. Once I give my heart, it's for keeps." "I'm beginning to count on that," Harriet replied, leaning subtly into his touch. The kiss, when it came, was tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. Harriet answered by stepping closer, her hands coming to rest on his chest where she could feel his heart pounding beneath the damp fabric of his shirt. Brody deepened the kiss, one arm circling her waist to draw her against him, while his other hand cradled the back of her head. Harriet had been kissed before, chaste, proper kisses from Richard that had never made her feel like this. This was fire and promise, tenderness and hunger combined in a way that made her forget everything but the man holding her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Brody rested his forehead against hers. "I should apologize," he murmured, "but I'm not sorry." "Neither am I," Harriet assured him, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, "though Mrs. Peterson would certainly revoke my lodging if she knew." That drew a chuckle from him. "We should get you back before she sends out a search party," but neither made a move to separate. Instead, Brody pressed a kiss to her temple, then her cheek, then the corner of her mouth with devastating precision. "The rain's letting up," he said eventually, though his arms remained around her. Harriet nodded, reluctantly stepping back. "I have 30 children expecting their first lesson tomorrow. And a reputation to protect," Brody added, his expression growing serious. "Harriet, I want to court you properly, with your permission." The formal request, so at odds with the passion of moments before, made her smile. "I'd like that very much." The return journey to town was filled with shy glances and newfound awareness. They spoke of practical things: the school, the ranch, the approaching summer, but beneath the ordinary words ran a current of excitement and possibility. At the boarding house door, Brody kissed her hand with old-fashioned courtesy that belied the heat in his eyes. "Good luck tomorrow, schoolmarm. Those children don't know how fortunate they are." "Good night, Brody," she replied softly. "Thank you for the evening, all of it." He waited until she was safely inside before leaving, the sound of the buggy wheels fading into the night. Mrs. Peterson was waiting in the parlor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "Storm catch you?" she asked, eyeing Harriet's damp appearance. "Yes, but Mr. Austin found shelter until it passed." Harriet tried to sound matter-of-fact, though she suspected her flushed cheeks betrayed her. "He's a responsible man," Mrs. Peterson observed neutrally, "always sees to others' welfare before his own." "Yes, he is," Harriet agreed, unable to keep the warmth from her voice. The older woman's knowing smile followed her up the stairs. In her room, Harriet realized she was still wearing Brody's coat. She should have returned it, but part of her was glad for the oversight. Hanging it carefully on a hook, she ran her fingers over the wool, remembering the feeling of his arms around her. Tomorrow she would begin her career as Durango's teacher. It was what she had traveled across the country to do, the fresh start she had sought. Yet somehow, in the space of a week, her vision of that new life had expanded to include possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine. Harriet's first day of teaching was both exhilarating and exhausting. The children were a diverse group, some well-prepared, others barely literate, all curious about their new teacher from the East. By the end of the day, her voice was hoarse and her feet ached, but she felt a profound satisfaction in the work. She was erasing the blackboard when she heard a knock at the schoolhouse door. Turning, she found Brody standing there, hat in hand. "Thought you might need this," he said, holding up a jar of honey. "My mother always said nothing soothes a teacher's throat after the first day like tea with honey." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. "That's very kind. How did you know my voice would be tired?" "Educated guess," he replied with a smile. "How did they do?" "Wonderfully. They're bright, eager children. Some need more help than others, but they all want to learn." Brody nodded, looking pleased. Town's been needing this for a long time. Most of these families couldn't afford to send their children away for schooling. As they talked about the day's lessons, Harriet was acutely aware of the shift in their relationship. Last night's kisses remained unmentioned but ever present between them, informing every glance and gesture with new significance. "I should walk you back to the boarding house," Brody said eventually. "Unless you have more work here, I'm finished for today." She gathered her things, including the honey jar which she tucked carefully into her satchel. As they walked through town, several people greeted them. Harriet noticed the curious glances directed their way, the knowing smiles of the women, the appraising looks from the men. Word traveled quickly in small communities. "People are talking," she observed quietly. "Does that bother you?" Brody asked, his expression concerned. Harriet considered the question. In Boston, such gossip would have mortified her. Here, somehow, it seemed less important. "Not as much as I would have expected," she admitted. "Though as the teacher I should maintain a certain propriety." "I respect that," he assured her. "I meant what I said about courting you properly. I don't want to complicate your position here." They reached the boarding house steps, pausing in the late afternoon sunlight. "Would you join me for dinner on Saturday?" he asked. "At the hotel restaurant, very public, very proper." "I'd be delighted," Harriet replied, smiling up at him. He tipped his hat, his eyes conveying what he couldn't say in the middle of town. "Until tomorrow, Miss Jennings." "Until tomorrow, Mr. Austin." The following weeks established a pattern. Harriet taught during the days, occasionally staying late to help struggling students. Brody would often appear at the schoolhouse with some small pretext, a book she might find useful, information about a student's family circumstances, questions about the school's needs. Their courtship proceeded under the watchful eyes of the community. Saturday dinners at the hotel became a regular event, as did Sunday visits to the Austin ranch, where Clara enthusiastically supported their growing relationship. "I've never seen him so happy," she confided to Harriet during one such visit, as they watched Brody demonstrate lassoing techniques to some of the younger ranch hands in the corral. "He smiles now, actually smiles. The men don't know what to make of it." Harriet laughed, though she was touched by the observation. "He has a wonderful smile, it transforms his whole face." "That's what happens when the right person comes along," Clara said wisely, belying her 19 years. "Mother always said when you find your match, everything else falls into proper perspective." By mid-May, most of Durango had accepted Brody and Harriet as a couple, though no formal announcement had been made. They were careful to maintain propriety, limiting physical contact to brief touches and the occasional kiss when they could steal a private moment. It was during one such moment, in the schoolhouse after the children had gone, that Brody first spoke of a future together. "I've been thinking," he said, his fingers laced with hers as they sat on the front bench, "about building an addition to the ranch house. A proper library, perhaps, more bedrooms." Harriet's heart quickened at the implication. "That sounds like quite a project. Worth it, though." His thumb traced patterns on her palm. "For the right reason. And what reason would that be? She asked, hardly daring to breathe. Brody met her eyes directly. I love you, Harriet. I think I have since that first night when you stood in the rain, soaked through but still holding your head high. I want to marry you if you'll have me. Though she had begun to hope for this, the actual words still overwhelmed her. Brody, I know it's soon, he continued quickly. We've known each other less than 2 months. If you need more time, I don't, she interrupted. I love you too. I've been falling in love with you since you wrapped your coat around me in that storm. The joy that spread across his face was answer enough, but he sealed it with a kiss that left her breathless. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. I've been carrying this for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. He opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small, perfect diamond. It was my mother's. Clara insisted you should have it. Tears filled Harriet's eyes as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It's beautiful. Does this mean yes? He asked, a hint of vulnerability beneath his smile. Yes, she confirmed, wrapping her arms around his neck. Yes, I will marry you, Brody Austin. They agreed to announce their engagement at Sunday dinner with Clara before making it public. In the meantime, Harriet wore the ring on a chain beneath her high-necked blouses, a secret joy close to her heart. Clara's reaction to their news was everything they could have hoped for: tears, hugs, and immediate plans for the wedding. August would be perfect, she declared. After the summer roundup but before harvest, we could have the ceremony here at the ranch under the big cottonwood. Oh, Harriet, you'll be my sister. The town's response was equally enthusiastic. Mrs. Peterson sniffed that she'd known all along those two were meant for each other, while the school board congratulated themselves on hiring the teacher who had captured Durango's most eligible bachelor. The only concern came from an unexpected quarter. 2 weeks after the engagement announcement, Brody arrived at the schoolhouse looking troubled. What's wrong? Harriet asked immediately. I received a letter from the school superintendent in Denver, he explained. Apparently, there's a policy about female teachers marrying. Once you're wed, you'd be expected to resign your position. Harriet sat down heavily at her desk. She'd heard of such policies in Eastern schools but hadn't thought to inquire about them here. I see. Brody knelt beside her chair. I know how much teaching means to you. If you want to delay the wedding until they find a replacement, or even if you want to continue teaching instead— No, she interrupted firmly. I love teaching, but I love you more. We'll find another way for me to contribute to education here. Relief flooded his features. I was thinking about that. What if we established a small lending library at the ranch, open to anyone in the county who wants to borrow books? You could oversee it, perhaps offer reading lessons to adults who never had the chance to learn. The idea immediately appealed to Harriet. That would be wonderful, and perhaps I could tutor children who need extra help or even adults who want to improve their education. We'd build a proper space for it, Brody continued eagerly. That addition I mentioned, we could design it to serve as both library and teaching space. Harriet's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. This man understood her needs without her having to explain them, valued her skills and intellect as much as her companionship. It was so different from what she'd known with Richard, whose interest in her had never extended to her mind or ambitions. I love you, she said simply, reaching up to touch his face. More than I thought possible. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of preparations. Harriet finished the school term, saying emotional goodbyes to her students with promises that she would see them at the ranch library once it was established. A new teacher was hired, an unmarried woman from Wyoming who seemed competent and kind. Brody began construction on the addition to the ranch house, working alongside his men when he wasn't busy with cattle operations. The plans had expanded to include not just a library and teaching space, but a music room with a new piano. The old one can stay in the parlor for everyday use, he explained when Harriet questioned the expense. But you should have a proper instrument for your lessons. My lessons? She asked, confused. Several parents have asked if you might teach piano once you're settled at the ranch, Clara explained. Word of Brody's playing has gotten out and people assume you must be equally talented. I'm proficient but hardly a virtuoso, Harriet laughed, but I'd be happy to teach what I know. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect in early August. As Clara had suggested, they held the ceremony beneath the sprawling cottonwood tree near the ranch house, with nearly the entire population of Durango in attendance. Harriet wore a new dress of ivory silk ordered from Denver, with Clara's help and Brody's insistence on sparing no expense. "You'll only have one wedding day," he'd said when she protested the cost. As she walked toward him on the arm of Sheriff Taylor, who had kindly offered to give her away, Harriet felt none of the nervousness she'd expected. Instead, a profound sense of rightness filled her. This was where she belonged, not just in Durango or at the Austin ranch, but with this man who looked at her as if she were the answer to every question he'd ever asked. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with traditional vows spoken in voices that carried across the assembled crowd. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Brody's kiss was both tender and possessive, drawing cheers from their guests. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food, music, and dancing on a wooden platform constructed for the occasion. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit, casting a golden glow over the festivities. "Happy Mrs. Austin?" Brody asked as they swayed together to the music of a fiddle and accordion. "Completely," Harriet assured him, leaning her head against his chest. "And you, more than I ever thought possible." His arms tightened around her. "I still can't believe that broken-down stagecoach brought you to me. Perhaps it wasn't chance," she suggested. "Perhaps it was destiny." Later, when the last guests had departed and Clara had tactfully retired to her room, Brody led Harriet to the master bedroom that was now theirs. The space had been transformed with new furnishings, fresh curtains, and a larger bed that made Harriet blush despite her anticipation. "I have something for you," Brody said, retrieving a package from the dresser. "A wedding gift." Harriet unwrapped it to find a leather-bound journal with her new initials embossed on the cover. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "I thought you might want to write about your experiences out here," he explained. "Your journey from Boston, starting the school, our life together. Someday our children might want to know how it all began." The mention of children brought a fresh warmth to Harriet's cheeks. "Our children," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that, so do I." Brody's hands came to rest on her shoulders, his touch both gentle and possessive. "I love you, Harriet Austin, and I love you," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "My rescuer, my friend, my husband." His kiss was different this time, deeper, more urgent, unrestrained by the propriety that had governed their courtship. This was a beginning, not just of their marriage, but of a life neither had imagined possible before a rainstorm brought them together. Epilogue: 5 years later, the sound of piano music drifted through the open windows of the Austin ranch house, mingling with children's laughter from the yard. Harriet's fingers moved confidently over the keys, demonstrating a simple melody for 10-year-old Sophie Miller, one of her regular students. "Just like that," she encouraged as the girl attempted to replicate the tune. "You're improving wonderfully." From her seat beside the piano, 3-year-old Elizabeth Austin watched with solemn attention, her dark curls and blue eyes a perfect blend of her parents' features. On the floor nearby, 1-year-old James played with wooden blocks, occasionally looking up at the music with a grin that was purely his father's. The lesson concluded just as Brody appeared in the doorway, his tall frame filling the space. Though 5 years had added a few lines to his face and threads of silver at his temples, he was still the most handsome man Harriet had ever seen. "How's our next concert pianist progressing?" he asked, winking at Sophie. "Mrs. Austin says I'm doing very well," the girl replied proudly. "I can play 3 songs now." "That calls for celebration," Brody declared. "Clara's made fresh lemonade." After Sophie had been sent home with a glass of lemonade and promises to practice, Brody gathered his son into his arms while Elizabeth clung to his leg. "Busy day?" Harriet asked, noting the dust on his clothes that spoke of ranch work. "Productive," he confirmed. "The new breeding stock is settling in well. How about here? Many visitors to the library. 4 this morning, including Mr. Jenkins, who's finally finished that copy of Twain you recommended." Harriet smiled, remembering how the grizzled miner had declared it the finest yarn he'd ever come across. The Austin Ranch Library had become an institution in the county, with over 300 volumes now available for borrowing. Harriet's adult reading classes had helped several ranch hands and townspeople achieve literacy, while her music lessons provided cultural enrichment previously unavailable in the area. Clara, now 24 and engaged to the new doctor who had set up practice in Durango the previous year, joined them in the music room. "There you all are. I thought we might take the children for a picnic by the creek after lunch. It's such a beautiful day." "Wonderful idea," Harriet agreed. "Brody, can you spare the time? For my family, always." He set James down to toddle toward his aunt while scooping Elizabeth into his arms. "Besides, I believe you promised to teach me that new duet." "I did indeed." Harriet's eyes met his across the room, and after 5 years of marriage, the connection between them was still as electric as it had been during that stormy night in the lined shack. Later, as they sat beside the creek watching Clara help the children gather wildflowers, Brody's arm settled around Harriet's shoulders. "Remember our conversation about destiny that night at our wedding?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. "Of course." She leaned into his embrace, fitting perfectly against his side as she always had. "I've been thinking about it lately," he continued. "How different our lives would have been if that stagecoach hadn't broken down, if it hadn't rained that night, if I hadn't decided to ride out to check the eastern fence line." Harriet considered this. "Do you think we would have found each other anyway?" "I have to believe we would," he said firmly. "Some things are meant to be, rain or shine." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Though I'm grateful for that storm and every drop of rain that soaked your dress." "As am I," Harriet agreed, turning her face up to his. "For the rain, for your coat, and most of all, for your love." As Brody's lips met hers in a kiss that held the passion of their beginning and the depth of their years together, Harriet thought of the journal he had given her on their wedding night. She had filled it with their story from that first rain-soaked meeting to the birth of their children, and had started a second volume just last month. There would be more volumes to come, she knew, more chapters in their shared life. And through all of them, like a golden thread binding their days together, would run the love that had begun with a storm, a ruined dress, and a cowboy's coat offered with unexpected tenderness. The ranch, the library, their children, all of it had grown from that simple act of kindness. As Clara called to them that the children were ready to return to the house, Harriet and Brody rose together, hands intertwined. Stepping forward into the future, they continued to build day by day. It wasn't the life Harriet had imagined when she'd left Boston, but it was infinitely better, richer, fuller, and more meaningful than she could have dreamed. The rain had indeed soaked her dress and wounded her pride that night, but Brody Austin had covered her with his coat and his love, and in doing so had given her the greatest gift of all, a place to truly belong.